Coexistence to Conquest, International Law and the Origins of the Arab-Israeli Conflict tells the story of how the Arab-Israeli conflict began during the last decade of the 19th century and the first 50 years of the 20th century. The book essentially argues that a lot of the most of the problems that continue to plague the Middle East and the fundamental issues of the Arab-Israeli conflict began during the British Mandate of Palestine, when Palestine was conquered by the British Empire after the First World War. The book's published by Pluto Press, an academic publishing house in London, and I wrote it during the Bush administration's war on terror, so-called war on terror. So it was very much a product of the experience of living through those years. It was also influenced by my studies, obviously, as a lawyer, and also my experiences of living in Bethlehem, in the West Bank during the Second Palestinian Intifada in the years 2003 to 2004. Where I worked for a Palestinian NGO called Badil that specialized in refugee rights. I also have family from Bethlehem. My father's from Bethlehem, so I had a direct interest in the topic through my family roots. The book is about 400 pages long. There's a foreword dedicated to the book by the famous international lawyer Richard Falk of Princeton University, who also served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Human Rights for a number of years. There are 9 chapters in the book and a number of very colourful maps which are taken from the National Archives in the United Kingdom, showing Palestine before the First World War, and various plans to divide and partition, not just Palestine, but the greater Middle East, Sykes-Picot, and other places, and various partition plans that the British had, starting with Peel during the Second World War. There were some secret plans, and then ending with the UN partition plan in 1947. So the book begins with, the first chapter of the book is called Anti-Semitism, Colonialism and Zionism, and argue that these 3 issues were linked, and that British imperialists in the early 20th century supported Zionism primarily as a way of redirecting Jewish immigration into this country. So that's when you had the Uganda plan to establish a Jewish homeland in East Africa. You had various plans to establish a Jewish homeland in North Africa, and also in the Sinai Peninsula. And in this chapter I show how some of the key officials, many of the lawyers who were involved especially in the Uganda plan, were also involved in the Balfour Declaration that promised the Jewish people a homeland in Palestine. And these people were also very close to Balfour himself. And so I point to connections between Balfour, when he was the Prime Minister of this country, when the Aliens Act was passed in 1905, and then I show how in 1917 the same cast of characters, advisors, individuals, lobbyists, assembled again after the loss of Gallipoli and the formation of a coalition government with the Conservatives in 1916, 1917. And I feel like this kind of history is underplayed in most studies of the Balfour Declaration, who try to focus on the language of the text, but not Balfour himself. And it's rather curious, because if you look at Balfour, he wasn't a person you would think would champion Zionism, because he was in fact had very controversial, you might say, racist views of Jews and other minorities. So it's not something you'd want to highlight, but I highlight it in this chapter because I think it's important to understand these connections. And colonialism was a device, if you like, through which the Balfour Declaration found expression in the League of Nations mandate system, and, if you like, became enshrined in a very unequal form of international law. In chapter 2, I look at what I call the scramble for the Middle East, which is modelled on the idea of the scramble for Africa, where during the First World War, the great European powers, France, Italy, Britain, the Russian Empire before the Bolshevik Revolution, conspired to partition the region into spheres of influence, and then at the end of with a view to controlling these territories at the end of the First World War. And I go through the various, I look at Sykes-Picot, Hussein McMahon correspondence and the Balfour Declaration, and I point out, for instance, that the Sykes-Picot agreement doesn't say anything about a Jewish homeland. So although it seeks to partition the Middle East into separate statelets that will be controlled by France and Britain, Palestine at this stage was to be internationalized, but there was no idea of establishing it as a Jewish homeland. This is something that came 1 year later, 1917, was the Balfour Declaration. This was then, despite these partitions were then, if you like, consecrated in law by the League of Nations in 1920 and 1922. And then you had the establishment of what they call the mandates system, which is when territories captured by, if you like, the enemy powers from the view of the Entente, from the view of the victors in the First World War, those who won the conflict, established, if you like, they were not colonies, they were not like formal colonies in the sense that they could be held on to forever, but they were supposed to be, they were similar to trusteeships. In other words, the end goal was, especially for the A-class mandates, was to have independent states. And so if you look at Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, these are countries today, even Jordan, but Palestine didn't become Palestine, it became something else, the state of Israel, which I'll get to shortly. And so I explain the whole system of the mandate system and this idea of it being a sacred trust of civilization. So it was a different form of rule, if you like. The idea that the great powers had a benevolent relationship with those who were colonized, and they were supposed to assist them, this is the language of the day, on the way to self-government and an eventual independence. And it's important, I think, or it's significant, that the A-class mandates were all in the Middle East. Other mandates like the B-class mandates and C-class mandates were in Africa and in the Pacific. And most alarmingly, even B and C-class mandates all became independent states. So it's even more alarming that Palestine is still not a free and independent state. The third chapter looks at what I call Arab opposition to political Zionism. So under international law, if a state or a party representing a state acquiesces to another power coming and taking territory, then this could be given validity. But I show this was never the case in the interwar years during the mandate and throughout the mandate period. In fact, beginning in the very first few years, you had uprisings or riots, if you like, small intifadas or bigger intifadas, was the Arab uprising in 1936 to 1939. In other words, I show that there was consistent opposition from day one to the Balfour Declaration. And there's also a little bit in the book when the first High Commissioner, Herbert Samuel, attempted to suppress a report which made it clear that the primary reason why the Palestinians were opposed to Zionism is because they didn't want it they were opposed to the establishment of a Jewish national home. Of course, bearing in mind that throughout this period the Palestinians were the majority of the population, as they were in the other Arab countries. Although, as I will explain, this was to change during developments in Eastern Europe and Germany before the outbreak of during the Second World War, before the outbreak of the Second World War. And so you really see, for instance, a link between Jewish immigration to Palestine and opposition to that. And because the Palestinians were prevented from expressing their opposition through a democratic process, because the political system that was established under the mandatory rule did not provide for, it did not take into account that the Palestinians were the majority of the population. So it established, if you like, a system of parity by giving power to British officials, Christians and Jews, but therefore it prevented the Palestinians from, say, passing legislation that would have prevented Jewish immigration. So the structure, if you like, the system was very oppressive to the Palestinian side. And therefore you see the biggest uprising in 1936, which is also when partition is first suggested by the Royal Commission that was sent from London. And this opposition coincided with a massive increase in Jewish immigration from Germany. And it was only in 1939, just before the outbreak of the Second World War, that Britain began to restrict Jewish immigration and actually passed a white paper saying that the policy all along had been to establish an independent Palestinian Arab state. And again, as we know, that would change after the Second World War. I then have a chapter on the Hussein McMahon correspondence. If you see the picture at the front of the book, it shows a picture of Allenby, Lawrence of Arabia, and King Abdullah of Jordan. And it just explains, it's simply, this chapter's a kind of legal, it revisits an old controversy. A lot of Israeli historians have always denied that the Hussein McMahon correspondence amounted to a promise from the British government to the Sheriff of Mecca to establish an Arab state in Palestine. So I go and I revisit the text of these agreements, and using my knowledge of international law and looking at other comparative cases at the time, I make a strong argument that in fact, Britain had made a pledge, one that could be recognized under international law at the time, and if you like, they then double-crossed the Palestinians, was the Balfour Declaration, which was obviously completely contrary to the idea of there being an independent Arab state and then a Jewish homeland. That you can't square the two. And I revisit this. I actually have a map which I've reproduced in the book in colour. You probably can't see this if you zoom in on the right-hand side here. But the map is a British colonial map in the National Archives here in London, which showed that the area over which the British government had promised to establish an independent Arab state to the Sheriff of Mecca. And the area included the whole of what is now, the whole of Palestine, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, all the Gulf states, Saudi Arabia. And it appears Yemen too. So it would have been an enormous Arab state. So you can see that a lot of people Palestinians felt they were double-crossed when this was thrown out of the window, because the whole purpose of that agreement was to provide, on behalf of the Arabs, was to provide support for the British army during the First World War against the Ottoman Empire. Chapter 5 looks at self-determination. So in 1917 Woodrow Wilson began to speak about self-determination and the rights of people to determine their future destinies. Lenin, in establishing the Soviet Union, also spoke of self-determination, although in a very different way to the way Wilson understood it. And so this idea of self-determination was widely debated. And again, it's of course crucial, because if you're establishing a Jewish national home in Palestine, this appears to be contrary to self-determination. In other words, at the very time that the Americans and the Bolsheviks are proclaiming this principle, we have an example again in Palestine of a flagrant violation of that very idea. And I go again through colonial correspondence, memoranda. I show, for instance, that Balfour's private secretary thought that the whole British policy in Palestine was a flagrant violation of self-determination. And I basically go through and I show, the kind of Machiavellian double dealing that went on during the mandate period, and the way in which self-determination was kept away from the majority of the people. And if you like, in a way of not really granting self-determination to the whole people of Palestine, this idea of partition begins to be discussed, which is the topic of chapter 6 of the book. And partition is really discussed firstly in the context of Palestine. In 1936 was the first major Arab uprising in the context of a Royal Commission of Inquiry, the Peel Commission, that was sent to Palestine to look into the causes of the disturbances. Unsurprisingly, they said the causes of the disturbances was a policy enunciated in the Balfour Declaration. But there were some members of the Commission who had been influenced by colonial projects elsewhere, such as in India and in Ireland. And so they came up with this idea of dividing Palestine by establishing a Jewish homeland in parts of Palestine, and then the Arab state would become part of Jordan. And then I draw connections between this idea, which kind of was discussed, and then it was rejected by the British government. As I mentioned in the white paper, they said that Palestine would be an independent Arab state. But during the Second World War, after the Holocaust, it comes back in to be discussed. And so I have a chapter on the UN partition plan, and I make the argument that partition could be criticized as being contrary to international law as it was being formed at that time. So I look at population statistics, land ownership. I look at the different regions of Palestine to show that in no single governorate of Palestine were Jews a majority of the population, nor did they own the majority of land. I believe more than 89% of the land, even at that late stage, was still in ownership of Palestinian Arabs. I then look at the way the UN partition plan vote, if you like, was gerrymandered and was very controversial on the floor. I look at, there were in fact two proposals at the United Nations at the time. There was a partition proposal that was favoured by the Western European countries and the United States, and then there was the anti-partition, if you like, the unitary state model that was favoured by Pakistan and the emerging, or should I say the countries that were independent. That was Egypt, Syria, and others at the time. And so I introduced this character called Zafrullah Khan, who was the foreign minister of Pakistan at the time, and he really leads the assault on the partition plan. And his speech is well worth reading until this day. It's really quite something to read, and he really shows the duplicity of the Western powers in supporting partition and in encouraging the survivors of the Holocaust to go to Palestine when immigration doors were closed in America at the time, in South Africa at the time, in the United Kingdom and Canada and Australia. And of course, the partition was a failure because movements on the Zionist side never, although they welcomed and said we support partition, in reality they were preparing a conflict to take more than their fair share in that United Nations partition plan. And so in chapter 7 I look at the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I showed that there were plans drawn up before the 1948 war in which there was an attempt to acquire all of mandatory Palestine, and that had it not been for the Arab Legion under Transjordan, they may have also captured the West Bank, and if the Egyptians hadn't come in through Gaza, they may have also taken the Gaza Strip. On the legal angle, I found some interesting documents, some legal opinions prepared by the Foreign Office legal advisors in London, saying that the intervention of the Arab states into Palestine was not contrary to international law. And this is quite important because one of the main arguments you usually hear from the Israeli side is that in 1948 Israel, a fledgling state, was invaded by its neighbors and emerged victorious. The story is far more complicated than that. And it appears that the intervening Arab armies, if you like, they were doing a form of humanitarian intervention. At least that is how you would describe it today. We must remember that before Israel declared its independence on the 15th of May 1948, some 350,000 Palestinians had been expelled from their homes. So it was only inevitable that the countries that were affected would feel obliged to act in some way. And international law did not necessarily prohibit that at this time. I then discuss in the last two chapters the Palestinian refugees. I look at the emerging right of return under international law and the emergence of human rights at that time. It was still in a state of development, but we must remember that the Palestinians were citizens of Mandate Palestine. They had rights there. With the disappearance of this structure, the rights didn't simply disappear. And so I made an argument based on not only on emerging human rights law, which, if you like, kind of began and came later, but on the very idea of a mandate, the very idea of a sacred trust of civilization, something that had been consecrated by the League of Nations. You had a state being established. A state has to have a population. That population is forced out, then it makes a nonsense of the law. And then I end with the creation of Israel, and I'll wrap up here. I point out that it's very difficult, if you apply the law as it existed at the time, to view that the establishment of Israel as lawful. It was although it's subsequently recognized by the great powers and then by many other countries, which is another issue. At the time, there were strong moral and legal arguments to say there was something not quite, fair, not just fair, quite legal in the way Israel was created, in the sense that you had this UN Charter, which prohibited, the use of force. You had a state that was born linked to colonialism. Okay, you could argue from their perspective there was a morality of it. They'd suffered the trauma of the Holocaust, despite the fact that the Western European powers were preventing immigration into their country. But I essentially show and look at the debates again. It was a very controversial moment in international law, and I guess I will leave the book at that. There is a lot more I can say about the book, but I will leave it here, and I hope that you enjoy reading it.